you can't deal really with Marion without considering what the British were doing. And of course, the road between Charleston and Camden was critical. And Nelson's Ferry was the crossing point. And because there were no bridges in those days, and the rivers would go 10 miles over their banks in freshet or when they flooded. So Nelson's Ferry was very important. Marion attacked at night in, I believe, 58 riders. And the British had stacked their weapons because in the humid air, the metal will attract moisture. And so they stacked their weapons. And usually they had a little tent-like canvas that went over stacked weapons. Anyway, they'd stacked them. And Peter already got to the weapons. And because Marion attacked in three parties. It's interesting that Marion always attacked on three sides, never four. And the reason for that seems to be that he felt, in fact, he said, that if men are surrounded, they'll sell their life dearly, which meant that would increase the danger to his men. And so he usually gave them an opportunity to escape. Of course, he killed quite a few before most of them took him up on it, but at any rate, that seemed to be the strategy. And that was a great embarrassment to the British. After all, we have British regulars and guarding prisoners, and this ragtag bunch from the swamp coming out and overrunning them.
They never knew where Marion was because he never stayed in one place. Yeah, he had his headquarters at Snow Island, but he wasn't hunkered down there. That was just sort of where they sort of touched home base.
Key to Marion's campaign was mobility. That meant horses. And he was always under pressure from the higher command to turn his horses over to the regular army, and he refused. He had to have those horses. He had to get those men on the move at night, travel as much as 70 miles, and then go into attack, and then run like crazy, because that was his other strategy. Without those horses, I don't know that we would have been successful.
He's traveling all night to get to this battle where he's going to attack these British at Black Mingo. And on the way, he meets up with one of his soldiers who were left behind. The guy had traveled 60 miles in one evening. So I think really we have a misunderstanding or misconception of how fast these troops actually were moving across the landscape. Musgrove's Mill. The Americans traveled about 60 miles to attack the British, fought a battle, realized they'd won a battle, but by golly, now the British were really going to be mad and going to be after them. They got back on their horses and rode and dispersed.
While Marion's brigade was on the run, and they occasionally got kicked all the way out of South Carolina, they're living in a series of base camps in the great Pee swamps all the way across the line into North Carolina. What could life have been like then? I'm sure he only had a small cadre with him until he planned an operation, maybe as few as 20 or 30 people. They had virtually nothing. They had the horses that they stole or impressed or captured. They had what weapons they could find. They had virtually no food. When Marion was able to get a piece of paper and write for supplies, you know what was always on the top of his list? Salt. Some salt for that stray cattle or the deer that they were able to kill. I'm sure those men were half-starved most of the time.
Enclosed is an order for salt, and beg you will be saving on that article, as my stock runs very low. For I have supplied General Greene in almost every corps in the state for a considerable time. Francis Marion, November 9, 1781.
As important as the partisans were in winning South Carolina's independence, we owe a great debt to Nathaniel Greene as well. Today we talk about mobile warfare, where you have a set army, but you also have very mobile elements, whether it's tanks or helicopters or what have you. Well, Nathaniel Greene used the partisans as his mobile element.
Marion was not well educated, but he certainly was smart, and he understood Greene's strategy. It had been what Marion had been doing, just cutting off here and there and taking control of small areas. And Marion, who had been discontent up until this point because it had been a very rough year, could understand that strategy, because although Marion was not well educated, he was extremely bright and was a military man. And after all, he had a career with the 2nd South, and he understood exactly what Greene wanted and was willing to cooperate fully with that.
Greene would occupy the main British force and basically draw a ring around Charleston, and he gradually tightened the noose around the city, whereas it was Marion and the other partisans' jobs to pick off the outposts one by one, which they did, and Marion was the most effective of them.
Well, when Greene took over the command of the army in the South, finally George Washington was able to select his own man. When he split his army and he moved his headquarters to Hicks Creek on the PD, which is where Shirley is now, and he sent Daniel Morgan out to the west. He sent Light Horse Harry Lee down into the swamps to find Marion, and that was not easy because, as Lee mentions in his memoirs, that Marion not only could hide from his enemies, but he also could hide from his friends, and it took a while to find him, but Lee and Marion did hook up there. Light Horse Harry and Marion attacked Fort Watson within a week of the time that Greene had made his decision, and then took Fort Watson and sent prisoners up to Greene. And so Greene, before Greene was engaged at Hubkirk Hill, he knew that Fort Watson had been taken. And it was a good thing because Francis Marion was out of ammunition, and up until the time he took Fort Watson.
John Watson was the person who created or built Fort Watson on the Indian Mound there near Nelson's Ferry. He named it for himself, and he built that in the fall of 1780 and began building it in December 1780.
Marion's riflemen were too much exposed at first to fire with effect, but Colonel Mayhem contrived to raise a tower of logs in one night so high that it overtopped the fort, and the marksmen began to fire into it. William James, Marion's brigade.
In March of 1781, when Watson was told to get at Marion directly, go after him, and to attack his camp at Snow's Island. And it fills in his role, his side of the story of what happened in that series of skirmishes as Watson was trying to get at Marion, and Marion was not strong enough to fight Watson in a stand-up battle, but instead kept hitting Watson and retreating, hit and run, hit and run, hit and run, hit and retreat, hit and retreat, hit and retreat, until by the time Watson got close to Snow's Island, his army was pretty well beat up, and so they retreated south into Georgetown to re-equip and rest.
Colonel Watson, I find, is on his way to Camden. This is rather an unfortunate circumstance, as the enemy will begin to be impudent and to show themselves without their works, which they have never ventured upon since the morning of the 25th. Our force divided, and the enemy collected, put matters upon an unmilitary footing. There is no further intelligence from Lord Cornwallis, which induces me to believe he is marching northwardly. Major Hearn will inform you of my plan. Supposing that to be the case, the Major will inform you also how far Lieutenant Colonel Lee is at liberty to continue to operate with you against the fort you were yesterday firing at. I should be exceedingly glad to have an account of the probable operating force you may expect to act with you for some months to come. This will enable me to judge with more certainty the propriety of the plans I have in contemplation. With esteem I am, dear sir, your most obedient humble servant. Nathaniel Greene, May 7th, 1781.